Got it. Okay. All right. Okay. Hello, hello, and welcome everyone. Especially hello and welcome everyone, especially those who are streaming our events right now on Vimeo, as well as our guest Xiaochang Li. I'm Layla Lin, a PhD student in anthropology at the New School for Social Research, and I'm also a member of PERN, or the Platform Economies Research Network. So today I'll briefly introduce PERN, and then our guest, and then I'll ask our guest to open the conversation with a short introduction of the paper that she has shared with us. So PERN, or the Platform Economies Research Network, is a learning collaboration that focuses on the socio-technical basis of platform economies. Our members share an interest in the question of how data becomes a value form by studying a variety of digital platforms and processes. PERN members are located in the US, Canada, Australia, and East Asia. And we come from different academic disciplines: anthropology, information science, political science, and media studies, as well as SDS. We run regular online meetings devoted to discussions of works in progress by our members, as well as guests. We also run these public live stream salon events that you are watching right now to kind of bring our conversations to the public. So for those who are watching us on the live stream, you can join the conversation by using the chat function on Vimeo. You can also stay up to date on what's happening at PERN by finding us on Mastodon at PERN@mastodon.social, or by signing up for our newsletter at platformeconomies.net. So with the advertisement part over, our special guest today is Xiaochang Li, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Stanford University. Her research examines questions surrounding the relationship between information technology and knowledge production and its role in the organization of social life. So the draft of the article that Xiaochang shared with the group in advance today is entitled "There's No Data Like More Data, Automatic Speech Recognition and the Making of Algorithmic Culture." The paper is related to her current book project, which explores the history of automatic speech recognition and natural language processing, and how the problem of mapping communication to computation shaped the rise of big data, machine learning, and related forms of algorithmic practice. So this article will be published soon in an upcoming issue of Osiris on human and algorithmic cultures, I believe in around July 2023. So welcome, Xiaochang, and I will hand over the floor to you now to kind of talk a little bit more about what the paper is about, especially for those who are watching us who haven't read it yet. And then also maybe just a little bit of something on how you've arrived at the current work, where you see it heading to, and anything else you would like us to know before we open up the floor for PERN members to share their questions and comments. So thank you. You're muted.
You would think after so many years of Zoom, we would have gotten accustomed to unmuting. But yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So to give people who might be watching who haven't read the paper a little bit of context, that this is a paper that looks at a period in the history of automatic speech recognition research that sort of spans from the early 1970s into the start of the 1990s, in which the field of automatic speech recognition, and after it, natural language processing more broadly, starts to shift towards what is known at that time as the statistical approach, which is what is now familiar to us as a kind of data-driven, sort of data-intensive machine learning approach that sort of depends on brute force methods, as a shift in AI research from what had been dominant at the time as sort of expert systems and what are known as sort of knowledge representation based approaches. So that essentially, instead of trying to replicate or simulate the human faculties that they believe to be salient to the sort of perception and interpretation of speech, right? Things like phonetics, semantics, morphology, all of these things, they started to simply train models on large samples of text and speech data. And so the paper sort of looks at this as a key moment in the development of AI and machine learning, and a sort of like a marker or like a herald towards what we see as the rise of data-intensive machine learning today in algorithmic culture, in that it is, producing a form of knowledge that allows for sort of simulation without representation, right? That it no longer has to describe the underlying phenomenon being predicted, so long as it can predict the most likely outcomes as a kind of relationship of inputs and outputs. And so this comes out of a larger book project that I'm currently working on, which is on the history of speech recognition, natural language processing in the US, which I kind of think of as a backdoor history into AI, essentially, which looks at a couple of different questions. One, which is this rise of this very particular kind of statistical knowledge that is sort of deeply predictive and premised on a radical ignorance of the phenomenon being modeled that seems to be everywhere, right? And so it's sort of a question of how it became so generalizable across so many domains, right? How is it that like the same thing we used to model financial markets, we use in bioinformatics, we use in like spell checking, right? Things that are both extremely high stakes, but also sort of suffuse everyday life. And then also another question that for me, coming from media studies, which is like how the problem of language ended up really shaping computing. Because as I started doing this research, I started to see more and more that like there's this like deep and abiding, right, obsession with language throughout the history of computing, of trying to make computers do language things, even though that is one of the things that computers seem to be particularly bad at, right? In that they are both sort of worse at it than humans, but also just that they seem to be not so amenable to the kind of like, right, variability and ambiguity that is built into language practices. So, it's trying to figure out like how it is that this becomes a kind of defining problem that, efforts to make language sort of tractable to computational processing starts to really shape the development of both like computer science as a form of knowledge, but also like the, thinking about like computer hardware and what we actually do with computers as machines in the ways that it also gets built into early HCI, right? So dealing with both this kind of epistemic and material conceptualization of what computing is and does. I think that's maybe an introduction. I'm happy to say more if you have particular questions that I should address before we get started, but.
Thank you so much. Does anyone want to start with a question? Or
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, just thank you so much. I must say, especially for those who are tuning in, like when this is published, definitely read it. I don't mean to like be giving this big plug, but I have to say I had to read it twice. But that was partly my ignorance of some of the material, and just like I was learning so much from it. So yeah, just thank you. So one of the things, like the big thing that I learned from this is like what you just said, right? How the problem of language shaped computing, which me personally, I hadn't thought about that in depth. And then sort of the other thing, me being someone who tends to study finance, is how data-intensive pattern recognition became sort of generalized as a practice, right? So both with what you're looking at, like with regard to mainstream AI and eventually natural language processing, but also in terms of like the shared genealogy, and I use that term genealogy really like front and center, with respect to finance or financial practices, right? So like this reliance on the Markov model, which is so ubiquitous, right? Or what's called stochastic modeling. So that's in the paper, and that's like that shared genealogy was really beautifully spelled out and very interesting to me. One thing that I wanted to just get some clarity on, so this is just like a super general question, is your point, because you sort of reiterate this point about new knowledge practices. And I think sometimes there's sort of a misunderstanding maybe that like knowledge practices in finance are one epistemology and knowledge practices in computing are another epistemology, when in fact, it's a shared epistemology, right? Like we have ways of knowing and producing knowledge, and they're shared epistemologies. So I guess my point is that your point is that these what you're describing as new knowledge practices are they're new knowledge practices relative to what data is, right? Not new knowledge practices about what the algorithms are generating, So it's not like, okay, natural language processing is generating X, Y, and Z, and that involves new forms of knowledge that are being generated. I think there's like a tension in the text that could be clarified a little bit, because what I understood is that you're saying actually what's new is that the way we're representing and even what's legible as data is what's new. So that's one thing. I don't want to go on too much in the interest of everyone on this in this meeting, but just one other thing, just to continue on that point about this kind of genealogy, which I'm imagining is important for your larger project. So you have two things running through the text, right, which you described in your introduction. So on the one hand, you have this like what was in the past, the dominant kind of knowledge-based methods, right, where researchers like, you know, in, I don't know, AT&T and maybe IBM, but you describe this historically, right, where those researchers elaborate like the rule structures using linguistic and contextual information, and the human analogy was sort of what was important, right? And the practices were aimed to replicate human language faculties, right? That's one side. And then on the other side, you have this representation of language in terms of statistical likelihood, like what we do on our phones, right? Words appearing in a sequence, right? And that's based on patterns that are established by training large quantities of sample text data, right? That's the statistical approach. So you have this like knowledge-based approach and the statistical approach, which are at odds, and the statistical approach wins out, right? So we get prediction kind of wins out over replication historically. That's kind of what you describe. So, so you show us how prediction prevailed, which is like an incredible genealogical effort that you do. It's so helpful. And I'm curious, like what happened to number one, right? Like what happened to those knowledge-based methods or the commitment to simulate human faculties? Because like there are places where you indicate that it didn't entirely disappear. And so you might not have documented it, so it's an unfair question, but I'm asking kind of in the spirit of like a Foucauldian genealogy, sort of excavating the silent constituents of knowledge practices. So I'm just wondering if there are places where that knowledge-based method is still sort of lurking or still significant. And I should say the reason I ask, and then I'll be quiet, is that it's really interesting for me because of the application to finance, right? So the statistical method is a way of representing and formulating knowledge claims about the state of finance, right? So like what is stocks value will be, right? But what value will be, right? But it's not just to like analyze existing financial data, right? It's also how finance is represented in the first place. Like before you analyze the financial data, we need to produce truth claims about what is finance, right? Like in the first place. So I hope I'm making sense on that, but that's my interest in this. So I'll be quiet. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I think, you know, to start with the finance bit, I think one thing I do also want to highlight too is that it's not so much that, you know, I don't want to give the impression that, you know, this work done in language recognition was the sort of source of stochastic modeling in finance. Obviously, that those genealogies end up sort of converging. Of course, there's a lot of that sort of mathematical energy that's happening in the kind of post-war period in finance, drawing out of cybernetics, right? That ends up sort of converging with, you know, these kinds of other things coming out of computing that leads up to sort of like high frequency trading, right? Quant finance and all of that. But this kind of brings a new kind of energy to it and a new set of computational expertise too that I think sort of scales it up in a certain way, at the particular moment, especially in the specific lineage of the IBM researchers and Robert Mercer and all of those guys as they moved into Renaissance technologies, where they had all of that mathematical expertise already, right? That they, had previously had some of the originators of some of those mathematical models, but Mercer and all of them brought a new expertise of how to implement that at like computational scale. But I think too, your point about that sort of finance being always already a speculative exercise, right? Like that the ground truth of finance is always already predictive and speculative in this kind of way, I think is really fascinating. I'm not sure, that this is one area that I've always wanted to think about, but just haven't had the chance to like clear out what that specific relationship, right, between finance and these other kinds of computational cultures has been. And on so what happened to the knowledge-based AI methods, right? Like what happened to knowledge engineering? Yeah, I don't think they've disappeared. Certainly, they still remain in specialized domains in which where the aim is actually still to model as a means of investigation, right? So you might see it in if you're doing speech recognition for like speech pathology, right, where the aim remains to investigate what is happening with the sort of human body and human faculties, that certainly remains. But also, I think, there is growing energy within like computational linguists and computer science, and the folks that I'm talking to now who are, interested in sort of bringing linguistics back, right? And I don't know exactly how to characterize what is new about these ways, but in a way that does not feel quite the same, right? Like in a post-data way that is integrated still with these kinds of data intensive methods, right? But what I suspect what it kind of feels like to me is that it feels like a little bit of that data, the sort of figure ground flip that we see constantly with computing, in which, in the piece that I'm talking about, we see them say like, oh, we don't have to model it like humans, right? Airplanes don't flap their wings. It doesn't have to work like humans do. It can work completely differently, but come to the same ends. And then eventually that turns into, but maybe humans do actually work like this, right? Maybe humans are actually just computers. And you constantly see these little sort of figure ground flips over and over again. I think there's in one of the big AI textbooks, I think it's the third edition of the sort of Russell, like, AI modern approach textbook, they use that airplanes don't flap their wings metaphor, but they follow it up with something like, and this isn't an exact quote, I have to look up, but it's something that is sort of essentially saying like, because birds don't understand aerodynamics, right? So the thing that becomes the sort of the ground truth flips. And I suspect that is a little bit of what might be happening to a kind of new form of knowledge engineering that we're seeing now. But I haven't looked at it very closely, really.
Yeah. I just last follow up, not a question, just I wonder about the defense, the world of like the defense research and defense industry, but that's separate. Yeah. Thank you. Vicky.
Sure. It was really, I thought, a beautifully written paper. So I second Janet's thing to get people to read it. It's hard to have a page turner in the social sciences, but it was really a really enjoyable read. And I loved the things about, airplanes don't flip their wings, really great quotes throughout it. I was taken by the discussion of IBM and the dynamics of IBM's interest in the shift in the choice of pathways and of going to big data, and that seemed to be less tied to, you mentioned it in passing, that they had an interest, they're worried about the computer industry flagging and the demand dropping off, and so that they really were interested in also for business reasons rather than technical or linguistic reasons. It was kind of a third force coming in of them trying to build an interest in big data for their own financial reasons, their own business reasons. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship of those different forces at play. How important was that as a dynamic? And did I read it correctly in the paper?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think there's a couple of things. One, part of that is some of that internal mythology of the industry. And so I do think we should take it with a small grain of salt, though in this case they understood their work, right, as being motivated by questions of computational processing, right, in which speech recognition was in essence a good use, right, testing ground or use case to do that kind of work, to kind of find an application that was compute intensive, essentially, right? Because what they were afraid of was that, processing speeds and computational power was outstripping consumer needs, right? And they needed to continue to drive a market as a company that was sort of the dominant in the computing market at the time. But there is, and IBM is a really large company, and there's a lot of different pieces at work there. They did, of course, have speech and language research happening first in their sort of, they had a lab out in San Jose that they were working on speech processing and speech synthesis, that they sort of moved out to Raleigh, which is where some of those early linguists and speech researchers that were sort of lent to the continuous speech recognition group in Yorktown came from, right? And so it's certainly not as clear cut a division as the engineers in the continuous speech recognition group would have presented it as. And so for me, it was important to show the way that they understood their work because it fundamentally shaped the kinds of things that they produced. I will say that there is a really interesting dynamic in which, the researchers that I spoke to, many of whom were part of that sort of core inaugural team that remained throughout, really felt that I think they said something like Fred Jelinek, who was the director, was a closet linguist, right? That when he said that the system improved every time you hired a linguist, he didn't really believe it. And in fact, one of the things that they said was that, they said Robert Mercer, they were like, Bob didn't say it, but he believed it. Fred didn't, right? And so there was also that tension internally in the group as well. And in fact, one of the other stories that they like to tell, which is that they, eventually moved into machine translation. And they only did that because Fred Jelinek went to Cape Cod every summer. So when Fred went away on vacation, then they kind of applied their statistical methods to machine translation because they thought he wouldn't be on board for that, right? And then when he came back, he ended up being on board for it. But it certainly wasn't that they were just like, engineer forward all the way through. There was a lot of different interests and conflicts at work. But part of what I think really shaped it internally at IBM is that this is also a period, especially in IBM research, that they were working very, very freely and independently, that there was they were really allowed to pursue wherever their kind of interests led. And part of why they started to leave in around 1993 and so on was because the relationship at IBM Research between IBM Research and the sort of corporate demands of the larger companies started to shift a little bit, right? And they weren't allowed quite as much freedom to sort of pursue whatever they thought was interesting. And so part of it is that, there were a lot of different competing interests internally in the company, but the group was largely allowed to pursue it as they wanted to.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Sure, thanks so much. I love this paper so much, and thanks for discussing it with everyone. It's really amazing how it sort of manages to zoom into these particular mathematical techniques and then zoom out to the interests of economic actors at the time, and I just think it offers such a wonderful nuance through this epistemological shift around the centrality of statistics that frames it not merely in terms of the ascendancy of some sort of statistical form of knowledge, but really, the point that I took away is that it was through the influence of entities like IBM that speech recognition became a problem of computation rather than a problem of speech. And I think that point is so fascinating. And talking about language recognition in this paper, as this group discussed it, there was inevitably like some discussion of contemporary phenomena like large language models and ChatGPT, and some of these familiar questions that I'm sure everyone has been encountering about how to understand the sort of statistical outputs of these language models. And it made me wonder, because one of the things that like ChatGPT is used a lot for is for coding, right? And so there's this interesting sort of reversal perhaps at play, where the completion of the process by which language becomes a problem of computation has hit a point where now the problem of computation is becoming a problem of language. And I wonder to what degree you see that prefigured in some of these phenomena. And I should say that we have a wonderful colleague or a scholar at UC Santa Barbara, Fabian Offert, who has written a little bit about the idea of sort of language models providing the basis of like general computation, like this, what you were talking about in terms of generalizability of LLMs. Well, now it's like the generalizability of machine learning. Now it's the generalizability of large language models that's becoming, a new paradigm. Yeah. And so I wonder if you see some of this reversal prefigured in the archival work that you've been doing, or in sort of the work you've been doing, and perhaps whether some of the sort of political economic tendencies that you saw are being replicated in this flipping of the ground truth, to reference what you were discussing before about Janet's question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I haven't thought so much about the sort of shift to also use it in coding, in part because, to me, that is actually a kind of earlier practice in which they were, right, that before they actually had the data to train models, they would do kind of statistical modeling using artificial grammars, which were, essentially like artificial, right, strictly like language systems that had very strict syntax and grammatical and structural rules that had to be followed, which are essentially what programming languages are like, right? And in that sense, it seems somewhat obvious that they would be able to do programming with it, in that it's in many ways an easier problem than what they would call natural language processing. But I do think it's part. I think it's part of an issue in which there's I think a historical situation in which I would agree that I don't think computing was ever separate, right? In that, there's a kind of genealogy of computing from like signal processing that is very much always already a language problem as well, right? That is about the sort of transmission of messages and signals, that is also at the root of sort of many computational practices. And so, I think there's also an element of it in which the, computer science is not special as a form of knowledge, right? In that part of what is happening is that this becomes a way of doing all knowledge, right? and part of, I think, what the fantasy of machine learning is this idea that you can perhaps ultimately reduce all things down to some sort of like elemental particle that is then generic across all things, so that you can then model all things, right? That we just have to find the sort of data points that is sufficiently small enough that is the kind of atomic form, the quanta, right? If we want to think of quantification as like the search for the quanta and not necessarily just like counting, that can be used as the basis of a model for all things. And so I think in that sense, computer science and programming is no more special than any other knowledge practice in that respect.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Jing.
Hi, Xiaochang. Nice to see you again. It has been so long. I remember last time when I ran into your work, I know that you were working on speech recognition, and you were still at Max Planck, I think. So that was a long time ago. I was like, oh, how challenging, because compared to text recognition, image recognition, speech recognition would be the most challenging field, most challenging area in this field of AI. But turns out, like when I read your article this week, I was like, oh, wow, it's still very timely, because people are talking about ChatGPT and generative AI. And this piece actually unpacked a lot of that, like kind of the black box part of this technology. Yeah, so congrats on the progress. And so, I mean, I really like this article in the sense that we know that in humanities, we study AI, and also people started talking about generative AI only by criticizing the problem of proximity or reduction. But this article, kind of this history of speech recognition, kind of show us, so what are the normative foundations that has underpinned this kind of shifts from simulation to generation, right? So I guess so this is kind of maybe it's off topic, or I wonder if you, I don't know if you want to include this in your book while developing this article, or include this article in your book. But so when I'm reading this article, I feel it's not only a history, I also feel it's kind of a biography of this group of computer scientists, right? And this piece actually provides us an opportunity to dialogue with this group of people who believe in the power of computer, believe in the power of machines to simulate, but also to generate language and maybe even knowledge, right? So I'm trying to think, so if I have the opportunity to be in conversation with this group of people, what question am I going to ask them? So probably I want to, yeah. So this is kind of like a cocktail question, although it's not appropriate to bring up alcohol very early in the morning. But yeah, it's kind of trying to be light and easy. So probably I want to introduce Walter Benjamin to them, and then also talk about the aura, right? The work of reproduction. And then, so I want to ask them, what do you think about the aura when you kind of turn all this language into something, into a series of codes of simulation, or into a whole process of generation of new language or AI language? So yeah, so I wonder if you have any responses on this idea of aura.
Ooh, tough one.
As a media studies kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I can provide a satisfying answer to the question of aura. I will say that like it does seem like a fundamental shift in thinking about what language is and does, in that it's a way in which language is no longer, right? Like, we no longer understand language as something to be interpreted, right? That its significance is not in the meaning of its contents, but in like the sort of tallying of its frequencies, right? That it is a way of extracting, you know, some kind of information from the data of language that is not necessarily, you know, linguistically significant, certainly not, but also maybe not even like human perceptible, right? And it is in that way that I think, you know, it becomes very hard to talk about aura, because it's fundamentally a kind of shift into sort of modes of like differentiation, right? And understanding what things and relations exist in the world that don't lend themselves to the sort of human perception, that aren't necessarily legible to the ways in which we see things, which I think, you know, you bring up image recognition, you see it's much more obvious in the context of image recognition, because we're like working with the visual, right? In the ways that, like, you know, image recognition systems don't see things. They don't even really see like lines or shapes or things like that. They are dividing the world up into sort of perceptual units that are, you know, completely alien to how humans understand, you know, sort of visual objects in the world. And it's similar here, right? So one of the things that isn't in this particular article, but that this group also ends up doing, is that they create a unit of sound, of speech sounds, that instead of using breaking up speech sounds into phones, right, which are like human perceptible differences in sound, they decide to just use the units that the signal processor creates, that are the length of time that I think it's like 10 centiseconds that they use, and then use a k-means clustering algorithm to then decide, like, okay, if I want to, you know, have 20 different speech sounds, just cluster these the sounds from the training data and tell me what the sort of informatically optimal set of sounds are, right? Like, what's my sound palette, essentially, right? If I have to reduce the number of variations. And so, and they end up calling it phenones, front end owns. And so, but these are not sounds that are differentiable to the human ear, right?
Exactly.
And so it's so hard to even talk about, like, you know, what happens to aura when we're no longer even working within like a human schema in that sense.
I see. Yeah, yeah.
I will say, I mean, obviously can't speak for these engineers, but I think sort of, especially the most like hardline engineering of them, you know, I think Mercer gave an ACM speech, you know, a few decades ago, where he talks about a dream of like being able to reduce speech even more to essentially like letter things, to like, you know, the most elemental characters. And so I think for them, it's not much of a concern, right?
Right. I see.
Because it's about the sort of transmission of information, like how to keep it maintain the integrity of the information being transmitted, and not necessarily its contents.
Can I just jump, because that actually relates to my original poorly expressed first complicated question about like the fact that knowledge-based methods were eclipsed, right? And so most, I think it's fair to say that most kind of social science critique of algorithmic produced generated knowledge, et cetera, is about like our loss of meaning. You know, and this goes back to like Walter Benjamin, hello, right? Like old school, sorry to say this for all of my colleagues, but a Frankfurt School kind of critique. It's all about meaning. And so we're in a world now where like, is that even a relevant form of critique? So this is a conversation I have with Martha Poon all the time. And I hope she's listening. But that, I think that's like a really interesting question, because can you even, it perfectly aligned with what you just said, which thank you, because you said it so beautifully, but is like, does it even make sense if we can't refer to substantive meaning with respect to these practices, right? Like the statements don't actually they're not, they're just if then, or they're, you know, logical statements. They're not about good, bad, right? And so you know, do we need then to like rethink the way we're producing critique, where we're like over here worried about meaning when meaning is like irrelevant, you know? Or do we say, well, those knowledge-based practices exist in some obscure places and we need to sort of do what we can to, you know, the human analogy matters still in some, you know, corners of the world, and we need to maybe be more attentive to them. So I know that you probably don't have an answer to that, like what is critique today question, but I do think that the old critical theory, you know, you know, Bruno Latour, I think it has lost its steam, as he would say, or did used to say. And yeah, so maybe just more of a thought, but if you have anything to say about that, I'd be interested.
Oh, yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, I'm not really, you know, I'm not sure. I'm hesitant to say that critique has no place. I'm still certainly invested in critique. I think it's a matter of being able to be a little bit more precise about the thing that is being critiqued. And that, of course, requires sometimes perhaps a deeper and more thorough technical understanding of the operations at work. That I think, you know, for me, often where some of the critique coming out of the social sciences will fall short is not so much that critique is insufficient as a whole, but that they are critiquing a thing that isn't happening, right? That the sort of discourse around opening the black box, or even the, you know, a lot of the awareness now about like, you know, bad data, right? Which I think is really important, but there are, I think, ways that we can still start to push further. You know, as Jim pointed out, like the kind of normative assumptions and priorities that get built into some of these formal techniques that are perhaps not obvious, right? In the ways that they map to kind of asymmetries of power, right? But will certainly, you know, be amenable to certain uses over others. You know, I think Wendy Chung's work is really great at this, and looking at some of like things like correlation and like K-nearest neighbor, and the ways in which those have assumptions about what things like similarity are, right? That I think part of what we might want to do is to push to think in that same way as they do, as to not just stop at like, oh, this is very reductive because it does not well represent the thing, but to say like, but what does it represent, right? How does it reconfigure what what we understand like fundamental relations to be? You know, one of the things that I've been thinking about also in relation to this work, especially in relation to like acoustics and things like that, is the shift into thinking about inclusion as a function of range rather than presence, right? That under these kinds of mathematical models, for, you know, for something to be included in and covered in the data, right, is that it falls within the range being discussed quite often. There's an early example of this in some of the work at AT&T, in which they test the sort of speech. They're trying to do some early like template matching, and they're testing the speech frequencies that they need to kind of include in their models of speech. And they, you know, test hundreds and hundreds of people. And then at the end, they found that the you know, range of women's voices falls within between the range of men's and children's voices. So then they just toss out all the data from the women, right? Because they didn't need it, because it was already included, right? Like and so like it's those kinds of maybe more minute shifts that I think we're now in a position to kind of dive into, since I think we've pushed quite far already with some of the sort of larger sort of computational debates in algorithmic culture, and all the very important work that's done around like the sort of social practices around creating these things, to look now at some of the more minute shifts in the sort of formalizations and what they're doing.
Thank you.
I love where this is going. Sorry, you can't see me, but I've got children everywhere. So anyways, because one of the questions I've been working with is why isn't speech recognition everywhere in aviation, right? I mean, there's all these kinds of early ideas about aviation as the model, or we can think about how aviation automated things to translate elsewhere. But then it doesn't happen. And in fact, AI is very, very limited in the cockpit. And there is a few interesting things there, which, I mean, obviously it's difficult because of the noises and whatnot. But one of the things that pilots would say is that the context is what really matters, right? So when you have a decision being made with a machine with 350 people on board between, you know, going up or down and potentially killing everybody, then the context when things are uttered is really important. So it sounds like when you shift the model from, you know, trying to replicate the human and its capabilities to a set of data set, then maybe some of that context gets sidelined a little bit for the ability to recognize statistically certain things. And I'm wondering whether this is one of the cases that then people were struggling with, like once we actually have to apply those models in these more statistical forms, will they then, you know, enable or preclude specific use cases because we have sort of sidelined the context more? And the second thing that would tell us is, because obviously there's a question about, you know, who then gets to decide what the context is and should be, right? So there's also a lot of questions about microdynamics of power, which is what you sort of highlight. But I was wondering, you know, to what extent that sort of ability to think through the application then shaped some of these early decisions about where to go in terms of the models to be used for developing speech recognition.
Yeah, I mean, context is very funny because one of the really interesting things about speech recognition is that they start trying to do it quite early, right? That you start, you know, of course you have these like early hoaxes and sort of proto speech recognition machines, but even in computing, they really start to pursue it in like the late 1950s, right? And this is in computer science, not in telecom, which is very curious, right? And when I first started this work, I was just deeply baffled by it, because at the same time, you're also seeing all these you know, reports and articles in which they also don't know what they would want it for. Right? And so like one of the things that they do come up with, there's like, oh, astronauts, aviation, right? Things that you might not be able to kind of be in one place and use your hands and all of this stuff. But it was always very strange to me that they were basically trying to do speech interfaces before they did typed inputs, right? This was like before they had keyboards as a kind of standard input for computers. And it baffled me for a really long time until I was talking to a colleague of mine at NYU, Elaine Nooney, who does a lot of work on the history of computing. And she looked at me, she was like, yeah, because engineers didn't know how to type, right? And then I went back and looked and was like, this is in the footnotes of all these things. And it all of a sudden, once I was aware of it, it became so obvious and came up over and over again that this was just like an attempt to reduce the friction between man and machine. But the friction they were talking about was secretaries, right? They were talking about the administrative support needed, and the belief that in order for computers to be general purpose machines that would be widely and popularly adopted outside of specific scientific uses, right, as like specialized calculating instruments, was, you know, if you wanted military and business executives to start using this, you would have to make it so that they could use it without always having an administrative assistant as the go-between, especially if it was some real-time things like in a military context. And so, you know, I think that's a way that those sort of contextual things of application really start to emerge. But I think that the point you make about sort of cockpit use too speaks to a deep tension in machine learning, and this particularly kind of like data intensive and like knowledge reductive methods, which is that there is fundamentally no account in these models about what it is that the data is of, really, right? A part of what makes machine learning really powerful is the portability of models trained on various forms of data. But of course, any set of data points might actually be, right, influenced by a whole host of factors. And because they aren't modeling the processes themselves, right, there's actually really no way of telling if you are capturing and therefore modeling your system off of data that is of like contextual factors, right? Or the thing it is that, right? So if you're taking health data from one location to another, there's a question of whether that is actually like data about like a patient issues, or if that is actually, right, data reflective of like insurance systems or administrative practices or things like that, or the ways in which like predictive policing is actually predictive of like policing practices, right? Like it's all of that stuff, right? All of those forces are being captured into these small data points that are then ported to other places. And so it's very hard to sort of track and maintain a kind of like cleanliness around context in that way, because it already gets baked into the data, which I imagine is a problem for something like aviation, where you have to make very fine-tuned real-time decisions about what to change and shift when you don't actually know which of those things are affecting the data.
Oh, I think Fabio's probably too busy with the children right now, but I thought it was fascinating. I have some questions, but also I'm seeing some questions from the audience, the people watching the live stream too. So at some point I'll bring them up. But so for me, I'm really fascinated by this like discussion about radical ignorance. The kind of so the idea that with this kind of shift in shift to statistical kind of practice, that it's not that it's not that like we don't understand languages, but rather that they don't need to or want to know how language works at all. So I'm just curious about then what do they know? What do they need to know in this new kind of world? So for example, like how do the machine learning computer engineers kind of troubleshoot, like when in the kind of scheme that you're describing, like when the sounds are like phenomes, like how do they like try to train the data set in a way that can produce desirable results? And then I'm curious to kind of just see how radically different then like knowledge is mobilized in this case, as versus like how humans will troubleshoot meaning interpretation kind of based problems.
Yeah, so like one of these things is like a shift to what we might call like demonstrability, right? Which is that we don't care if it represents accurately, you only care if it predicts well. So the way you test a system is that you just run it and see if it predicts the things that you think it should be predicting, right? You set aside a chunk of data away from your training data, that's your test data, right? And then once you've trained your model, you test it and see if it predicts the things that appear in the text data like you would expect it to. And if it doesn't, you just go in and manually tweak parameters until it does, essentially, right? Like that, it is sometimes probably more complicated than that, but often you will hear computer scientists say like, yeah, you just kind of hand tune things until it starts producing the results that you expect to see, right? And so that is one of the issues that then comes up when we're talking about then turning the systems towards things that are meant to be sort of preventative, for instance, right? Because at that point, you never really in the real world test how well it predicts, right? Because you need to intervene on those predictions.
Could you say a little bit more about the hand tuning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies. So I can't speak to like precisely how they do it in any given instance, but right. So, in any model, after you train it, you get a set of like weighted parameters, right? And part of it is like if it doesn't predict well, you go back in and you say like, okay, well, maybe we need to weight some factors differently manually, right? You would typically automatically train to do this, but maybe make this adjustment, or maybe say like, oh, maybe we count this as, right, we take out some of this data, or there are all kinds of ways where you just go in and then kind of make adjustments to the data, to the ways that the sort of things get weighted in training and things like that, to then say, okay, now try it this way. Does this predict well, right? Or you use a slightly different kind of model, or they're all, but it's overall a process of like trial and error, essentially, right? You train it. If it predicts well, then it predicts well. If it doesn't predict well, you go and change some things, train it again. But it's not necessarily based on account of, oh, well, we know that this phenomenon works this way, so we'll want to necessarily weight this kind of data more or versus this, right? It's not necessarily a reasoned process in that way. But it's a kind of like, certainly when you talk to engineers, and of course there are people who've done sort of ethnographic studies of these things, it is for them like a kind of expertise and intuition, right? That they also develop, like, oh, well, if we know it doesn't predict well in this particular way, I know if I tweak these kinds of parameters, it'll make a difference, right? Versus others. It's a sort of expertise in engineering in like the system, not necessarily in the thing that the system is modeling.
And I wonder if you can like, because you were about to like, because it seems to me that in this case, then trying to make the system to like either not do or do one particular very specific thing would be really hard, right? Right, because it sounds like tweaking the parameters is affecting the whole data or whole model, and then so that like, so it seems to me the implications that, oh, because you were about to explain more on that in terms of like what there now calls for biases or whatever, like they don't preventative measures, like how can, but if there's so much opacity in how the algorithm works, then how could like the kind of machine learning industry actually respond to like calls to like, I don't know, audit the code, or like, I don't know, make it so that the AI models are not like biased or whatnot? Like, is that even possible? Like, are people even talking at the same kind of plane?
I think generally, I think they're not necessarily communicating that clearly between these two worlds when they talk about auditing the code, because like they know how the algorithms work. The algorithms are fairly, relatively speaking, fairly simple. It's just that the way that the algorithms produce outcomes is not predictable, in the sense that they are non-deterministic, right? So these are stochastic systems. They're not going to produce the same outcome anytime. And you can't make adjustments that will sort of deterministically produce a certain kind of outcome that you want. What you're trying to do is make predictions that are on the whole close, right? Overall within like a range of like statistical significance. And so it's really sort of two different issues, which is that I think, one, there's a disconnect in sometimes when we talk about like what it is that needs to be audited, right? And I think that's shifted much more. I think the understanding of like what machine learning actually does has really grown in the past 10 years, right? Amongst sort of a kind of more popular and policy audience, and a greater awareness that a lot of it is happening at the point of data, right? And so part of that push has been to try to look for obvious biases in the way that the data is being produced, which I think is important, but I think won't get to all of it either, right? And so that, like I was saying before, part of that is also to think about the kinds of algorithms as in terms of like the formal techniques, less in terms of how they would necessarily produce biases in this particular instance, but to kind of look at the kind of normative priorities that those techniques have and the assumptions that they make about what entities and their relations are at a more basic level. To say like, maybe, if we have an algorithm that is trying to put together things that are similar to one another, maybe that's not very good to use for like newsfeed recommendations if we don't want to create silos, right? Because it by design will continue to group things that are like one another, right? And so on and so forth. And so I think, those are the, and I think too that I don't want to say that all of those calls for more transparency in practice are futile. I think they're really useful. I just think that sometimes they are a little bit imprecise, and I think imprecise in a way that leads people on the technical side to be very dismissive of it, because then they can just say like, oh, well, it's not interpretable. So, what do you want us to do, right? But that's not really the issue at hand, right? And so I think it's beholden to all of us sort of who are working in these like kind of social scientific spaces to really be able to get precise in what the asks are. And I think that is happening, right? But
yeah, just I know there are some questions that Layla was going to take from the input, but I just wanted one thing, because it tags onto your response to Fabio about portability and context, and then just what you were just saying right now. And the PERN members will, I'm always harping on the same point, so apologies to my friends, but it's like this question of value, because this is really the PERN's focus is value. But so there's one way we could think about this, which is like the value of, I'm just making up two random examples, right? One would be the value of language models, right? Like depends on exponential increase in data sets, right? Another one would be like commensurability, which you refer to in your paper, which is like data points or data set are valuable across domains, or maybe even certain algorithms. I don't know. But the overall conclusion from this, and then I know all of my PERN friends are going to cringe when I say this, but is the data is capital. And I really struggle with this. And so the reason why I struggle with it is, not just for theoretical reasons. It's actually because I do research in fintech. And it doesn't matter whether you're in, Europe or Africa, the industry people, they're often complaining about the problem of value, right? So it's like either they're complaining about data dumps, or they're complaining about like different data structures where valuation actually becomes a problem. You just gave an example about like the health industry and insurance versus like personal, you could come up with myriad examples, I'm sure, right? So like in general business economics, capital is like a productive input. So you're like, okay, data, right? It can be cash, it can be equity, it can be debt, it can be assets. Data, you could say it's an asset. Like that makes sense to me, right? In the academic, political, like economy world, like academic writing, capital is inherently linked to the creation of surplus value, right? Like it's the means of production. So whether we're citing Marx or not, we're using Marx, right? And so I just don't know. I'm not saying this with respect to you, but there's like this general claim that data is capital. And I think what you're describing is really helpful, because it's like anything of value is not necessarily capital, right? So for example, right, if data is a productive input, we could say, therefore, we're in a mode of capitalist production that's fundamentally driven by data as capital. And I'm like, I'm not sure, right? Some of what you're describing is actually really interesting, because it's like there's an aspiration for commensurability and there are claims about commensurability, but in the actual practice, you're showing how actually this sort of fails, partly because the context problem and the interpretability problem have been eclipsed, right? Does that all make sense to you or not? I'm just very, I think also if data is capital in that mode of production sense, that might be true, but we really need to show it. I think it's often said and not shown. And so that's where I'm coming from by asking this question. But I think your work is really interesting because you're sort of the beginnings of showing how that commensurability problem, you know, it holds in some cases, but it fails often. So anyway, that's yes, I'll be quiet. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I haven't really, I try not to sort of get into the sort of debates around what it is data is, just because I think for me, you know, it may be an asset, it may be a commodity, it may be capital itself. I'm not sure, right? I think it depends, you know, on the historical context, and it depends on like a kind of elaborate apparatus for the valuation of data more so than anything in particular about the data itself, right? And I think that speaks more broadly to machine learning, which is that, you know, I'm not really afraid that computers will do these kinds of things better than people can. I'm afraid that we are slowly going to adapt all of our infrastructures to be amenable to what computers are good at, right? And so I think for me that this question of like data and capital is similar in that I think it is less for me about what it is that data is usable as, and more about this sort of both like economic and epistemic apparatus that we have built around such that data can become usable as these kinds of things, right? In part also because like it actually doesn't matter if data is valuable in that way, insofar as like it doesn't actually matter if models are good at the thing we want them to do or not, so long as we decide that that does predict what we want it to. You know what I mean? Like we can talk endlessly about all the ways in which machine learning applications have been used for things like border control, for policing, in which they're fundamentally not very good at it. Like they're also not even that good at things like facial recognition, right? But part of what makes a kind of stochastic model really powerful is that it doesn't have to be correct, because it's telling you basically just the chance that the chance that it will be correct. It's a Bayesian trick, right? And so like it will still produce the prediction, and it will tell you the likelihood that that prediction is correct. And so it's a way in which like modeling can still operate, and it's a question of like how the consensus is formed such that that result has value for us.
Right, exactly. Yes, thank you.
I want to raise the two questions from the live stream viewers, because I think it's relevant, related to what you were just talking about. I'm gonna also put it here. I'll read it out, but I'll also put it in the comments. You can read it as well. So the two people are concerned about the risks and consequences of algorithmic systems. So one said that much has been lost in the shift from knowledge-based to data-based statistical natural learning programs. However, there are also major gains in terms of scale, speed, etc. What do you think about the gains, and where do you think now NLP will be without this model? And hold on, I'm not seeing the. And what do you think about the risk of algorithmic systems? And then a second person kind of have a similar question in terms of, she said that natural human language change is shaped by many factors, migration, media, culture. What do you think of the consequences that you see of statistical approach for shaping human language? Yeah, I think you've already touched on that, but maybe if you could just kind of respond to these more general terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll try to answer these things kind of together. You know, I'm not necessarily speaking, I'm not actually worried about like that it will like lead to an impoverishment of linguistic expression amongst humans, right? I think, you know, from as a media studies scholar, right, we see these kinds of anxieties crop up again and again, that the new technology will lead to impoverishment of the human senses in one way or another. And that, you know, I don't think that happens. I think, or at least for me, those are not the risks that are front and center, insofar as I think the risks to the ways in which we like exploit and devalue labor in the production of these systems, right? The sort of extractive quality that they take on, and the other kinds of assumptions that they built in, both in their discourses and in their implementation, that are for me so stark and so sort of brilliant that they really like make it hard for me to like look at or even focus on the sort of more individualized concerns about language use and things like that. But I just don't think those are at as much risk. I think for me, the kinds of risks that we have is not actually, especially with like language models, is not at the site in which those models are typically applied, in the sense that, like, you know, people automatically generating like term papers and things like that. I think these are also tools, you know, translation, all of these things. I think that can be like really fruitful and really useful. Like, I don't think there's a problem with these tools as such. I think for me, a lot of the risks comes in our assumption of what these tools are then capable of and what it is that they're doing. In part because, especially when we talk about language processing, what language processing really did that was different from the use of the same kind of models in a lot of other arenas is that it opened the door for that kind of algorithmic scrutiny into everyday life, right? That there is an assumption that language is the thing through which we do all things, right? And so, as we see in the like 90s, in the turn towards like text mining, which becomes a term which they say, oh, wow, we can use these kinds of models not only to make predictions about language, but predictions about the world, is that it opens a whole new kind of like Pandora's box of possibility, right? That I don't think we've like taken the time to really consider deeply enough. And so I think that for me is one of the risks. I think also that another risk for me is that because it is really hard, right, to scrutinize how it is that it's making these predictions. It becomes really hard then, once these are embedded in other systems, to then find sites of accountability, right? That is actually like a fundamental struggle in these kinds of systems, to figure out like when things go wrong, how do we hold people accountable? How do we identify what is responsible and fix that? And, you know, that there's like an entire kind of social field in which these things develop that needs to be really understood in that context beyond what the kind of like technical outcomes are, right? You know, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot too is that we've seen this shift, you know, towards a kind of like, you know, thinking about the sort of human in AI, right? Like things that are more user-centric, that are sort of more humanly ethical, human-centered AI, all of these things. And that's a discourse that comes from like user design, right? And one of the things that actually does is that it makes us think about these kinds of models and the implementation of like machine learning as only having impact on the people using it, right? Whereas like it centers ethics on the user and draws from a field that was designed for like military and like marketing, right? In which because you only care about, these are contexts in which you only care about the user because you're either they're non-users are either people who aren't buying your thing anyway, or they're people you actually want to harm. And so, you know, there are all these kinds of like, you know, discourses around these things that are getting baked into the systems and how we use them that I think go beyond the sort of more obvious harms of like algorithmic bias and like, oh, you know, if you do automated like hiring or something like that, like those harms are obvious and they are also very concerning, but I think there's also a larger world of harms that are in some ways like more basic to how we think about these systems that also should be taken into account.
Super interesting. Yeah. Layla, is there a second question or? Lydia, go ahead.
Hi, and apologies, I was shaky subway connection, so I'm not sure if this has already been asked. Yeah, like others I have said, thank you. This is a fantastic paper, super interesting to get this history. I have a couple of questions. One is around the relationship between, I know DARPA was also kind of funding and doing a lot of this research. Was there a relationship between the people at IBM diving in on this and the sort of more publicly funded projects? And then my second question is, obviously within the rush to figure out what people are going to do about the emergent AI technologies, there's always conversations happening about can it be regulated, and there's sort of this after the fact question, can we regulate after the fact? And so, you know, whether that's through AI audits or some vision that we might somehow sanitize the input data, or, you know, or whether there needs to be political regulation on the part of the corporations who are controlling this. I'm interested in what was happening at the stage of this product being developed, or this technology being developed. Was there any political engagement around regulation at the time?
Yeah, so, you know, with DARPA and IBM, they did eventually work more closely with DARPA. Some of the initial years of the continuous speech recognition group in the early 70s, like DARPA actually invited them to be a part of the speech understanding research project that they were doing that was like very AI centered. And they didn't take up that invite just because they didn't really need the funding.
Interesting.
But they, you know, in subsequent years, there was more collaboration, especially as they moved into machine translation. There was a lot more collaboration and interaction with the broader field of computational linguistics. And this really comes to the fore like in the late 80s and early 90s, DARPA actually starts to make a concerted effort to bring speech recognition and computational linguistics together, which, you know, we think of like NLP, computational linguistics, machine learning, speech rec as all kind of part of the same general umbrella of like areas in computer science right now. And that just was not the case until relatively recently, right? Like the work on speech is coming out of like telecom and acoustics processing, right? That was, it's core in many ways, like already a very engineering centric subfield. And it was not that closely linked to work that was happening in like computational linguistics, which was very much focused in those years and like, you know, that Cold War period on translation, right? And so computational linguistics and NLP were not the home, essentially, of speech recognition until really, I think, like the late 80s, early 90s, in which DARPA went through and produced a series of conferences, one where they brought these people deliberately together, but also created sort of standardized benchmarks, shared data sets, what they called bake-offs, which are these kind of like evaluation kind of competition things in order to merge those fields. And this is part of how actually a lot of those statistical techniques then make it into like computational linguistics and NLP. And so, you know, that kind of history is like many of these things, like quite muddled in that way, that it's never like so clear cut as, you know, one must kind of, you know, present it as just to like be able to tell the sort of course of events. But sorry, the second half of the question I lost a little bit was
sort of the was there any interest in regulating from
right
political sources?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's, I haven't looked that deeply into it. There's some sort of stuff that is happening in the 60s around like concerns about data privacy, and because this is like a moment in which they're like discussing the production of like data centers to store, right, like state data about its citizenry. But around the work that like, IBM and these groups are doing at the time, and things like speech recognition or even like image recognition, things like that, the regulatory energy isn't really there for it yet, because these are also still like very experimental. These are not, commercial systems, let alone anything that scales. And they're also not using taking data in that same way, right? They didn't have data actually for a long time. And so those kinds of concerns weren't there yet, right? A lot of the regulatory energy on tech at this time, of course, was like antitrust regulation, right? That was the kind of source of concern, because the kind of like large scale, like general public impact of these technologies wasn't even necessarily like foreseeable yet. Right?
Vicky, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the context of this paper in relation to your book as a whole, of what are the other parts of the project?
Yeah, sure. So the book project kind of spans a period, I kind of demarcate it as from like, the Russian mathematician A. Markov's development of like using Pushkin's Evgeny Onegin as the sort of material to conduct statistical trials for what become the development of Markov chains in like 1906 to, about like, I want to say like the start of the 2010s, where like these kinds of statistical techniques really get overtaken by neural nets, which I think follow the same kind of data-driven paradigm, but are at their core just a different set of kind of computational techniques in many ways that seem like a good stopping point, because otherwise I would just would never end, right? And so it kind of starts out basically in thinking about ways in which language actually gets brought into the laboratory in like early acoustics and physiological experiments in like experimental phonetics in the turn of the century and the sort of early 20th century, in which the kind of anthropometric and like colonial legacy of like measuring and comparing human faculties starts to converge with the sort of industry demands of telecommunications, right? And so we're looking at the ways in which kind of experimental phonetics leads into then communication engineering at Bell Laboratories. And that's sort of where some of that early, there's a couple of early chapters that focuses on work at Bell Laboratories in terms of like how these kinds of models, like both the sort of mathematical models and this particular application of them to language problems gets built into sort of early signal processing and what becomes like very early automatic speech recognition in like the wake of World War II. And then the IBM story that is a part of this. Oh, and then there's a chapter on the kind of early emergence of speech recognition at the intersection of like AI and HCI research, or what at that time was like man-machine communication, but it would have been like proto-HCI research in the sort of 50s and 60s in early computing, where these kinds of problems start to shape, right, both the sort of epistemic repertoire of computing, but also the kind of material imagination around like what computers are and who they're for. And then the IBM piece comes in as the kind of first turning point that the book matches, which is the shift from like modeling human faculties to sort of these kinds of data intensive, the model of data itself, right? And then this follows this story into how this stuff gets into machine translation, gets into the wider world of natural language processing, and then looks at this second turn, which is the sort of turn into text mining, right? In which they're no longer just the first turn, if it's like about techniques to predict language. The second is the ability to use language as a data source to predict other things, right? And that's the kind of second shift that looks at some of the kind of techniques and practices around that shift leading up to the rise of, data intensive machine learning starting in the 90s and the early 2000s. And is also like that second half is really a story also about how machine learning becomes data driven, because actually machine learning didn't start out that way either, right? The things that we associate with machine learning was also a shift that happens in machine learning in the 80s, in part as a result of these like standard benchmarks that are set around like the DARPA bake-offs and things like that, because it's much easier to demonstrate like incremental performance improvements using these kinds of techniques than with the kind of elaborate like general knowledge representation modes.
Super interesting. Not a
Yes.
small project.
Looking forward to it though, honestly. Yes, amazing book project. Lila, do you want any last things to say? Just to think we can wrap it up here now that we know what the book is going to offer us. Yeah, glad Vicky asked. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks so much for joining us and for sharing that incredible paper.
Thanks
to
to all of you guys.
Yeah.
Great questions. A lot of really fascinating stuff that I'm looking forward to like thinking about more deeply. So thank you so much for that.
We'll stay in touch with whomever who can certainly follow up. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Xiaochang.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to the people who are joining us on live stream. I'm gonna end it now, the live stream.